They called it a dinner party. That's what my mother told everyone anyway. Come celebrate Vanessa's big news. She'd sent the text herself, typed out on that phone she kept in a rose gold case, the one my father had given her for their anniversary. She sent it to aunts, cousins, people I hadn't seen since I was in middle school. She did not send it to me. I found out from my Aunt Doris, who assumed I already knew. I was 28. I had a job I liked. I taught second grade at a public school 40 minutes from the house I'd grown up in. I had a small apartment, a cat named Wednesday, a savings account I was proud of. I had a life that felt, for the first time, like mine. None of that mattered to my mother. What mattered to my mother was Vanessa. Vanessa is my older sister. She is 3 years older than me, and she has always been the one the family pointed at when they wanted to show people something good. Not in a cruel way. Or at least, not always obviously cruel. It was just the air in our house. Vanessa got straight A's, and I got good grades. Vanessa won the regional debate championship, and I joined the school newspaper. Vanessa went to Emory on a partial scholarship, and I went to a state school that gave me a full ride. My mother mentioned the partial scholarship more than the full ride. More than once. I didn't hate my sister. I want to be clear about that. Vanessa and I were not close in the way some sisters are, but she was never mean to me outright. She just occupied more space in our parents' world than I did, and she'd always known it, and she'd always accepted it the way you accept weather. The dinner party was for Vanessa's promotion. She'd been made a junior partner at her firm. It was a real thing worth celebrating. I was glad for her. I just didn't expect to walk in and find a man sitting at the table I'd grown up eating breakfast at, already comfortable, already laughing at something my father had said, like he'd been there a dozen times before. His name was Dean. My mother pulled me into the kitchen before I'd even set my purse down. "You remember Mr. Aldridge from Dad's golf club," she said, which was not a question. "I don't," I said. "His son, Dean." She straightened a dish towel that didn't need straightening. "He's been asking about you." I looked at her. "What does that mean?" "It means he's a nice young man and you're not getting any younger, and I thought it would be nice for you two to meet properly." "Mom, don't mom me. Just eat dinner. Nobody's asking you to marry him, except that was exactly what she was asking me. Not tonight, not in so many words, but my mother worked in a language I'd been fluent in my whole life. This dinner was the opening sentence of a paragraph she'd been composing for a long time. I was 28 and single and, in her opinion, making a mistake I didn't know I was making. Dean Aldridge was the correction she'd chosen. He was fine. He was polite, and he asked me questions about teaching, and he laughed at the right times. He was the kind of man my mother would describe as solid. She used that word a lot. A solid young man, a solid future. What she meant was, his family had money and a name, and they moved in the right circles, and she wanted me inside those circles, and she had decided this was the way to get me there. What she had not done was ask me. The thing about growing up as the second daughter in a family that loves you but doesn't quite see you is that you learn to shrink. Not all at once, gradually. You learn which battles are worth having and which ones will only leave you tired. You learn to smile at dinners and agree to things that feel a little off and tell yourself it's not a big deal because what would even be the point? I had been doing that my whole life. I agreed to have coffee with Dean the following Saturday. He was still fine. He paid for the coffee without making a show of it. He talked about his work, something in commercial real estate, offices and industrial properties, nothing glamorous but clearly stable. And he asked follow-up questions when I talked, which I noticed because not everyone does that. I thought, okay, he's decent. By the fourth time we went out, my mother had already told 3 relatives we were dating. By the 6th, she called it serious. I said, "Mom, we've been to dinner twice. That is not serious." She said, "At your age, serious happens fast or it doesn't happen." I let it go. 8 months later, Dean proposed. We were at a restaurant I actually liked. A small Italian place near my apartment that had good bread and low lighting and never tried too hard. He had a ring. It was too big. Not the size, the stone, a princess cut that my mother would have picked out herself. I found out later she had. I said yes. I don't know how to explain that without sounding like someone who should have known better. Maybe I should have. But here is what was true that night. I cared about Dean. He was kind in a consistent, unflashy way. He remembered things I told him. He did not make me feel small, not directly, and I was tired. Tired of being the daughter who'd never managed to be enough. Tired of the half conversations and the loaded silences at family events. Tired of being almost 30 and hearing the clock in my mother's voice every time she called. So I said yes, and the room felt smaller immediately after, but I told myself that was just nerves. The wedding was 7 months later. My mother planned most of it. She had opinions about the flowers and strong opinions about the venue and an absolute conviction about the guest list that included people I had never met but who were apparently important to the Aldridge family and therefore important to her. I showed up to appointments and nodded and signed things and told myself, "This is still your day, you're still here." My sister was my maid of honor. She gave a toast that was mostly about herself, about how proud she was of the family, how wonderful our parents were, how she knew I would rise to the occasion. She meant it kindly. But rise to the occasion is something you say about a challenge, not a marriage. I noticed that. I didn't say anything. The morning of the wedding, my mother came into the room where I was sitting in my dress. The makeup artist had just left. My mother looked at me for a long moment and then said, "You're lucky. Not every girl gets a man like Dean." I said, "I know, Mom." She said, "I mean it, sweetheart. Some girls, they end up with nothing. You could have ended up with nothing. You have a tendency to aim too small." I looked at myself in the mirror after she left. I was wearing a dress I hadn't fully chosen, at a wedding I hadn't fully planned, about to walk into a life that had been assembled around me by other people's hands. I thought, aim too small. I thought about my apartment with the good light, my classroom with the finger paintings on the wall, my cat, my savings account. I thought, what exactly did she think I had? Dean and I moved into a house in Alpharetta after the wedding. It was a nice house, 4 bedrooms, a yard, a kitchen with stone counters. His parents had helped with the down payment. My mother called it a very generous start. I called it a house in which I cooked dinners and graded papers at the kitchen island and felt, most evenings, like a visitor who hadn't quite figured out the rules yet. Dean was not a bad husband. I want to be careful here because this is a true story, and I am trying to tell it right. He was not unkind. He came home most nights by 7. He didn't yell. He asked about my day and listened to the answer with a kind of patient attention that I recognized as something he'd been raised to do. But there was a distance, not the distance of someone pulling away, the distance of someone who had never quite been there in a particular way. Like we had agreed to share a life the way people agreed to share an office. Professionally, cordially, without anyone getting too close to anything that actually mattered. I started noticing things. He took calls in the car instead of inside. He had a second phone that he kept in his gym bag, which I saw once when I was putting away laundry. When I mentioned it, he said it was a work phone, his voice perfectly even, and I said okay, because his voice was perfectly even, and I didn't know how to push against something that smooth. I started sleeping on my side of the bed the way you sleep in a hotel. Politely. It was my Aunt Doris who called me on a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of call that starts with, "I need to tell you something, and I don't want you to hear it from someone else." She had run into a woman at her book club. A woman who knew someone who worked with Dean. A woman who said, very carefully, that Dean Aldridge had been seen regularly with someone who was not his wife. I sat with that for a while. Then I opened the drawer in his home office where he kept the gym bag, and I found the second phone, and it wasn't locked. I want to skip the part where I read through it. Not because it wasn't real, but because anyone who's ever been in that moment knows the specific quality of that feeling, the way the floor stays solid under your feet, even though it should not, the way your hands keep working even though your mind has gone completely quiet. I read enough. I put the phone back. I drove to a parking lot I didn't know and sat there for about an hour. Then I called my mother. She was quiet for a long time after I finished. "You're sure?" she said. "I'm sure." Another pause. Then, "Callie, these things happen in marriages. If you go in there guns blazing, Mom, I'm just saying at your age starting over, Mom. He's been lying to me." She said, "I know, honey, I know." And then after a moment, "But the Aldridges, think about what you'd be walking away from." I sat in that parking lot for another 20 minutes after I hung up. That was the moment something shifted in me. Not broke, shifted. Like a piece of furniture you've walked past your whole life that you suddenly realize has been blocking the light. I told Dean that night. He didn't deny it. He sat at the kitchen table and he was quiet for a long time, and then he said, "I didn't know how to tell you." I said, "Were you going to?" He said, "I thought things might, I don't know. I thought it might resolve." "Like a condition," I said. He looked at me. "That's not fair." "No," I said, "none of this is." We talked for a long time. I will spare the details because they are ordinary in the way that painful things often are. No screaming, no thrown objects, just two people sitting across from each other in a kitchen trying to figure out what the wreckage means. At the end of it, I went upstairs and packed a bag. He didn't stop me. I drove to my old apartment, which I'd never actually given up. I'd been subletting it to a grad student who had just moved out. I still had the key on my ring. I let myself in. It smelled like paint and the particular quiet of an empty room. I sat down on the floor and I just breathed. Wednesday, my cat, was still there, with my neighbor who'd been watching her. I texted her and she brought Wednesday over at 10 at night, no questions asked, and I held that cat for about an hour. I thought about my mother saying the Aldridges. I thought about 8 years of trying to aim high enough. I thought, I'm tired of aiming at targets other people drew. The next 3 months were paperwork and silence and learning how to be in a room with my own thoughts again. I filed. Dean did not contest much. I think somewhere in him he understood that the terms he'd agreed to were his to own. We divided things. He kept the house. I didn't want it. My mother did not speak to me for 6 weeks. When she finally called, she said she was worried about me. She said she hoped I wasn't making a mistake. She asked if there was any possibility Dean and I could work things out. I said no. She said, "Callie, I just don't want you to be alone." I said, "I know, Mom." I meant it. I believed she meant it too, in her way. But alone and lonely are not the same thing, and I had been lonelier in that house in Alpharetta than I had ever been in any room by myself. Vanessa's second promotion party was 8 months after I filed. She was a senior partner now. Our mother had rented a room at a restaurant downtown, a real event this time. White tablecloths, a bartender, a microphone set up near the front for speeches. I went because Vanessa had asked me to come herself, just the two of us on the phone, and her voice had been different from how it usually was, softer. She said, "I'd like you there, Cal, just please come." So I went. I wore a green dress that I liked. I ate the past appetizers, and I talked to cousins I hadn't seen in a year, and I smiled, and I was fine. I was genuinely fine. The divorce had been finalized for 3 months. I had gone back to my classroom. I had started running in the mornings. I had a life again, and it was small and uncomplicated and entirely mine. My mother found me near the bar halfway through the evening. She said, "You look nice," which meant she'd been bracing for something worse. I said, "Thanks, Mom." She said, looking somewhere past my shoulder, "I want you to know I only wanted good things for you." With Dean, I thought he was I thought he'd take care of you. I said, "I can take care of myself." She looked at me then, something in her expression that I'd never quite seen before. Not guilt exactly, but something adjacent to it. Something that recognized it had gone somewhere and couldn't get back. She said, "I know you can." And then the microphone chimed and my Aunt Doris called for everyone to gather because Vanessa was going to say a few words. Vanessa spoke for a few minutes about her team and her mentors in the firm. She was good at this. She'd always been good at standing in front of people and filling space. She thanked our parents. She thanked her husband. She looked over at me and she did something I did not expect. She said, "And I want to say something about my sister. Because she doesn't know I'm going to say it, and because she should hear it in a room full of people." The room got quiet. I felt my face go still. Vanessa said, "Callie has been the kind of person who figures things out quietly, without making a show of it, her whole life. She moved back into her apartment. She went back to teaching kids who needed her. She did what she needed to do when things got hard, and she did it without asking anyone for anything. And I have not always made her feel like that was enough. And I'm sorry for that. I am genuinely, actually sorry. She looked at me. You belong in every room you walk into, she said. I know it took me too long to say that. I stood there in that room and I felt the thing you feel when something you didn't know you'd been carrying finally puts itself down. Not dramatic, not a rushing wave, just lightness. The particular kind that comes from being seen by someone who you thought had never been looking. My mother was to my left. I heard her exhale slowly. I didn't look at her. I looked at my sister, up there at the microphone, and I nodded once. She nodded back. Someone started clapping, and then everyone was clapping, and then the evening continued the way evenings do. More food, more conversation, a piece of cake that was actually very good. At the end of the night, Vanessa hugged me near the coat check. She held on for a second longer than expected. She said, "You doing okay?" I said, "Yeah, actually, yeah." She said, "Good." And then, like she'd been deciding whether to say it, "For what it's worth, I think Dean was never right for you." I saw it and I said nothing because I thought it wasn't my place. I should have said something. I looked at her. "When did you see it?" "Before the wedding," she said simply. I laughed. It was a real laugh, a little tired, a little helpless. She laughed too. "We're a mess," I said. "Yeah," she said, "we're working on it." I drove home alone that night. The city was quiet, the way it gets late on a weekday. Streetlights and empty intersections, and the kind of dark that doesn't feel threatening, just still. I thought about the version of me that had stood in that kitchen 8 months ago reading a phone she shouldn't have had to read. I thought about my mother's voice, the Aldred's. Think about what you'd be walking away from. I thought about what I'd actually walked away from. A house that never felt like mine. A bed I slept in like a guest. A life that had been given to me rather than grown by me. And I thought about what I'd walked back to. My apartment, the good light in the mornings. Second graders who needed someone to believe they could do hard things. A cat who slept on my feet. A savings account and a library card. And a body that had started running again and was getting stronger. I had aimed small my whole life according to my mother, but when I looked at what I had actually built quietly in the margins of everyone else's plans for me, it didn't look small at all. It looked exactly like mine. My mother called the next morning, early before I'd made coffee. She said, "Vanessa's speech was beautiful." I said, "It was." A pause. Then, "She was talking about you." "I know." Another pause, longer. I waited. She said, I think I made some mistakes, Callie, with the choices I pushed you toward. I thought I was helping." "I want you to know that part was true." I stood at my kitchen window with the phone and I watched the light come in. I said, "I know, Mom." I meant it too. I had known that for a long time. Knowing someone's intentions are good does not always make the impact easier, but it does make forgiveness possible. Not the fast kind, not the kind that pretends nothing happened. The slow kind. The kind you build over time, the way you build anything worth keeping. I said, "I'm okay. I want you to know that. I'm actually really okay." She said, "I can hear it." She sounded like she was crying a little. I made coffee after I hung up, and I sat at my kitchen table, and Wednesday climbed into my lap, and the morning came in through the windows, and everything was quiet and ordinary and entirely, completely mine. Have you ever been told by the people who were supposed to know you best that you were aiming too small? I'd love to hear from you in the comments. And if this story meant something to you, please share it with someone who might need it today. I've thought a lot about why things unfolded the way they did. Not in a looking for someone to blame way. I got past that a while ago, more like trying to understand the shape of it. Why certain things had to happen before other things could. My mother didn't set out to hurt me. I genuinely believe that. She set out to protect me the only way she knew how, which was to make sure I landed somewhere that looked safe from the outside. A good name. A stable income. A man who came from the right kind of family. In her mind, those were the ingredients for a life that wouldn't fall apart. She'd spent decades watching the world sort people by those exact measurements, and she believed them. That was her honest understanding of how things worked. But here's what I've come to think. When you love someone and you don't actually see them, When you substitute your own fear for their judgment, you don't protect them. You just transfer the risk. The thing you were trying to prevent still happens. It just happens inside a nicer house. Dean wasn't a villain, he was someone who also got carried along by a version of the plan. The right woman from the right family, the house in the right neighborhood, the life that looked correct. Neither of us had been honest enough, early enough about what we actually wanted. That's a hard thing to admit. I'd said yes when I should have said I need more time. I had nodded through dinners and appointments and conversations where something in me was quietly raising its hand, trying to get my attention. I overruled it because it felt easier. Because I was tired. Because I had spent so long shrinking that I'd almost forgotten what it felt like to take up space. That's the thing about choices made from exhaustion rather than clarity. They don't stick. Eventually the exhaustion lifts and you're standing in the middle of someone else's life, and you have to reckon with how you got there. What I know now, and what Vanessa's words cracked open in me that night at the restaurant, is that building a life from the inside out is not the same as aiming small. Knowing what actually matters to you and choosing it deliberately, even when it doesn't look impressive to anyone else, is not weakness. It is the hardest and most honest kind of courage there is. I had a classroom full of kids who needed someone to show up consistently. I had an apartment that felt like mine. I had a sister who, in her own imperfect, delayed way, saw me and said so out loud, in a room full of people without being asked. I had a mother who was, slowly and with difficulty, learning to let go of the blueprint she'd drawn for my life. None of that happened by accident. It happened because at some point, in a parking lot, on a kitchen floor, in a room that smelled like paint and quiet, I stopped overruling that small, persistent voice and started listening to it instead. That's the only thing I'd pass on to anyone in a similar place, not a formula, not a 5-step plan, just this. The voice that's been trying to get your attention, it's not asking you to blow everything up, it's just asking you to be honest. Start there, the rest tends to follow.